Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Teach Middle East podcast. My name is Lisa Grace, and today I have with me Morgan Whitfield, and she is the whole school director of teaching and learning at Amity International School, Abu Dhabi. And today we are going to be talking about changing the gifted and talented narrative in schools. Now, Morgan is very experienced in this field, so I'm going to be asking the questions and she's going to be giving us the insights. So sit back, relax, whatever you're doing while you're listening to this podcast, please get your headphones in and we're going to dive into gifted and talented, how we can reinvent it, reimagine it, and make it into something more fit for purpose for students and for staff within schools.
You are listening to the Teach Middle East podcast, connecting, developing, and empowering educators.
I'm going to ask Morgan to introduce herself. Hi, Morgan. Introduce yourself to our listeners, please.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I have worked in Canada, where I grew up. I've worked in the UK, and I've been out in the UAE for about a decade now, working in British curriculum international schools. So that's where my experience lies, but I'm really familiar with other school systems and curriculums, all of which are really kind of touched upon in gifted and talented and how we kind of address the gifted and talented narrative. It seems to exist across a number of curriculums all over the world. Right now, I'm the director of teaching and learning, and I'm writing a book for John Catt Education called The Enrichment Shift, which is all about kind of taking what we know about gifted and talented and putting it into something that's a little bit more inclusive and powerful. So we look at stretch and challenge.
Brilliant. And how I got connected with Morgan is a bit of a superwoman to me because Morgan is a mother. And she's also writing a book. She's the director of teaching and learning. And she's also one of the key committee members in planning and implementing the successful Abu Dhabi Teachers Conference, which many of you who are listening to this podcast might have attended. Now, how she does all those things is a baffle to me. Maybe she can start the podcast off by telling us, how do you juggle so much?
I think that as women, as women in education, I think that we're always asked to juggle a lot. And I think we collaborate and we lean on each other. I think that's the trick.
Yeah, no, like I was in awe because she's encouraging me to write my book, which, I've been resisting because human being here. I'm not superhuman like Morgan, regular human girl. And so I don't know where I'd get the time, but I really am intending to do it. I'm trying to see what I can do over the summer when things are a little bit on a slower pace for me here at Teach Middle East. But yeah, Morgan, you are the G&T person. And so we want to come to you with the first one. What is the current G&T narrative in education and why is there a need for change?
Well, I think it's really interesting because if you ask most teachers about G&T, they will kind of look at you and say, G&T, is that still a thing? And it means that it changes from school to school and place to place. So in the US, G&T is very explicit. There are very clear gifted and talented programs and very clear methods of identification. And it's something that you diagnose, which is really funny because I think that gifted and talented is really a social construct. And the definition changes from state to state, from school to school, from country to country. So it's kind of, it's almost something that doesn't really exist. It doesn't really have a tangible thing that we can grasp onto. Yet it means so much in education. And at the same time, we have other countries and other school systems where we say that G&T doesn't exist anymore. So I think in most British curriculum schools, they say, oh no, G&T doesn't exist. But we do use terms like high ability, high aptitude, and more able. We stream students, we set students. So as much as we may say that G&T doesn't exist, the G&T paradigm and the school structures and identification systems that we use are still very much present. And a lot of us, when we went through our education to become teachers, we were taught about high ability identification, that this was part of how we identify students. Most of the inspections that we have gone through, they ask very explicitly for us to identify our G&T students and make sure that we have a register. So even when we take a look at countries' policies, so if we look at departments of education, they're very clearly going to say, okay, well, who are your G&T students? It's part of something that we say has to be a part of schools. So I tend to think of G&T as this zombie where we can say that it's dead, we can give it a new name, but it's still walking around and talking all the time. So G&T is really a part of our system. So we kind of have to wrestle with that because gifted and talented has a very elitist, very antiquated, very sexist, very racist history. And so recognizing that, recognizing how much class and social inability is built into gifted and talented is part of us kind of changing the narrative into something that is fit for purpose, for something that is useful for teachers to have in the classroom.
Yeah. Why is there such a fragmentation of the system where some systems have completely banished the word, or while others have disguised it, and while others are still using it? What is the cause of that fragmentation?
It's actually really fascinating. So if you go back to like the very inception of giftedness in education, we have Lida Hollingsworth, who did a lot of research in the early 1900s, and Louis Terman, who came up with the very first IQ test. And I think Lida Hollingsworth, she very much wanted this to be part of differentiation. How can we best help students of all abilities? And Terman was very focused on finding, and it was almost a eugenics approach to finding out the best of the best and making sure that they were propelled forward in life. And I think that it also became part of the space race. So we saw in the US and Russia, there was this huge leap towards gifted and talented programming because it was part of a nationalistic agenda. So it was moving nationalism forward because they, again, were racing and accelerating the best of the best students. So it actually played out on a huge national stage. I always think of two examples when I look at gifted and talented programs kind of across the pond. The first one I always point to is in the US. And I think a lot of people are familiar with the magnet schools in New York City. Do you know anything about the magnet schools?
Yeah, I've heard of them.
Yeah, so there's about 8 magnet schools in New York City, and they are considered kind of the best schools because no matter what your background, no matter what your race in your class, every single student in New York City has the opportunity to go to these incredible schools that kind of propel them forward. They move them forward into some of the best universities, the most prestigious programs in the world. Bronx Science is an example. Bronx Science has created 8 Nobel Prize winners, which is more than most countries. Basically, it's the high school that they based Spider-Man off of. So like if they wanted Peter Parker to be a genius to go to school, this is the one that they based it off of. In order to get into any of these magnet schools, when you're in 8th grade, so about 13 years old, you take a test called the SHSAT. So it's maths and English and science. And that test that you take when you're in 8th grade determines whether you can get into these really prestigious schools. About 27,000 students take this test, but only a fraction of them get in because there's only so many places. So it's highly, highly competitive. And what's interesting about these schools is that they've become this lightning rod of controversy. So when we take a look at the New York City school system, about 70% of the students in the school system are Black or Latinx. While if we take a look at those magnet schools, only 10% of the population in the magnet schools is Black or Latinx. And that's just so glaringly obvious when you walk down the halls. Now, what's interesting is that white students are still disproportionately represented. But if we take a look again at Bronx Science, 77% of its student body is really diverse. They're minority ethnic groups. So 77% of the students, because they're Asian, if they're from the Philippines or India or Pakistan or China or Japan, all of those student backgrounds are represented, but you can see who's missing. So it tends to be an arbiter of social class, who are getting into those gifted programs when they are 4 years old, who has the language barriers that don't exist in some other places, which poor schools in New York are actually teaching the material. So in the US, you can definitely see gifted and talented is still very much alive. And it creates these cycles of inequality. And they make it quite obvious. Gifted and talented programs are something that you are diagnosed for. You take the equivalent of IQ tests to get into. In the UK, it works a little bit differently. So we might say in the UK that there is no such thing as gifted and talented, that it's kind of been forced out of the language that we use. But if you were to look at most schools, for instance, grammar schools that still exist in the UK, grammar schools, it's the exact same thing. You have the 11 plus. At the age of 11 years old, you have students that might have had private education or tutors or are preparing from a very young age to take the 11 plus to get into more prestigious and high achieving grammar schools. And then selective education as a whole, it still exists across the UK and in international schools. So as much as we might say that, okay, gifted and talented only exists over there, it very much exists everywhere. We can see pockets of it. So it is a really, really funny thing. The pedagogy is shifting to where we say in all those cases, we want more equity. So there's huge movements in the US to make, let's say, those magnet schools a lot more democratic for you to get into. And in the UK, we've seen huge fights against having these grammar schools still exist. We should close them down or at least stop them from opening again.
Yeah, I know in the UK, the grammar school system is so entrenched that when they try to fight against them, the powers that be really fight back, because a lot of them are products of either the grammar schools or they are products of, private schools in the UK. But how do you believe that this whole identification process of gifted and talented can become more inclusive? Or do we even need a process to identify them at all?
I think that is such a cool question because, of course, we need to know the abilities of our students that are sitting in front of us in our class every single day. So every single day, we have to be able to differentiate or we have to adapt our teaching to help those students. So it makes sense that we know abilities. But I think the way that we have identified students has been so poor. And we tend to be overly reliant on one single identifier. So I think if we take a look at like cognitive ability testing that we use pretty much universally in education, you can see that it's really problematic. And we tend to be really dependent on how a student does over maybe two tests that last 2.5 or 3 hours, where they're sitting in front of the screen and kind of identifying things. And we'll look at 4 batteries, their spatial, their verbal, and say this is the potential that student has. I've been in schools where we've taken their CAT 4 score, and that has determined whether they are on the gifted and talented list. And it has kind of problems with construct validity. It's not domain specific. All of these things that we kind of put too much emphasis on, kind of gathering this category of students. So there's CAT 4 testing. I'd also point to MAP testing. So we do like measures of achievement and progress, for instance. Those tend to be very specific to some subjects. So we can measure kind of achievement very, very specifically or progress. We can measure potential, but that doesn't mean that we are at all seeing the whole student. We're not seeing the students in front of us every single day in any kind of holistic way. So what I think is really, really interesting is we can kind of switch our thinking about kind of finding this category of student to instead cultivating gifted behaviors. And I think that's a much more interesting way to look at how we identify students.
Sorry, can I interrupt you? You said something about gifted behaviors. I want to dive into that. What are they?
So there's a few ways that you can kind of say what gifted behaviors are. There's a few categories. A lot of the times when we think of gifted and talented, we think of precocity. So if a child is precocious, they're going to move forward faster. And they're ahead of other students. So we tend to see it as like a race, when perhaps instead we should be looking at curiosity, which in a lot of ways seems much more ambiguous and much more immeasurable. A few of the ways that we can really change our identification procedures, or you can do things like you can use Renzulli's triad. So Renzulli's triad of identification looks at 3 different components. The first one would be more dispositional, and this would be things like self-regulation and metacognitive strategies. So when you look at things like task commitment, So do they have the strategies? Do they know how to self-regulate? That's going to tell you something about how they can actually achieve a task, how they can put effort in. Do they know how to work? So that's kind of one component. The second component would be aptitudes. And a lot of the times this is all that we look at when we take a look at maybe cognitive ability testing. Mm-hmm. So we say, okay, this student has really great processing, or they have really great memory. We say that they're really great at mathematics. So we can take a look and say, okay, there are aptitudes that a student has. We also have to take into account there's motivations there too, that a student might be more motivated to work in a subject that they're passionate about. Mm-hmm. And then the last thing that we can kind of look at when we look at Zuli's triad, this is probably the most important one. When we take a look at the third component, it's creative productivity. So creative productivity is one of those things where we have a student that's maybe in front of us that wants to do their own books. So they are doing creative writing all the time. They're the ones that go out of their way to actually design a coding game because they are passionate about it. They're the kids that they want to create something that is outside the curriculum or explore topics that are outside the curriculum they are currently studying because they're so passionate and interesting. But for some reason, that isn't quite counted. So that's one way of kind of identifying the students that are in front of you in your class every single day that are kind of crying out for extension, but our whole school identification procedures might miss them out for some reason, which is another thing when we're looking at multifaceted identification. We want to make sure that we are looking at subject specific, because if we're just looking at a CAT score, that doesn't tell me anything about how a student is artistically or creatively developing. So that can be really important. I think the other thing that we can do is we can recognize that students can have different abilities, but all students have gifts that can turn into talents. So instead of saying that there's gifted, which is kind of academics, so math, science, English, and talents, which is kind of left to, let's say, physical education and the arts. Gifts are something that we all have, and it's through a process of mastery and a process of deliberate practice that they can be turned into talents. And I think that's a better way of framing it, that it's a process. It's not something that, again, we are assigning a category of students to.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I especially like the fact that we need to look at the students who have interests that are really much outside of the curriculum, because I find that that narrowness of the curriculum does not allow for artistic expression and for expression of interests that are unconventional. For example, I take one of my sons. He is extremely passionate about the culinary arts, about food and tastes and combination. I mean, I find it really like he will come up with menus and Mom, can you put some chocolate on this? And it would be the weirdest thing. And can you add spice to this? And he's really, he goes off and he researches how you combine flavors and what you do and what creates certain flavors. He's really into that, but he's not really identified as gifted and talented or anything like that. You know what I mean?
A lot of students aren't, and they want to reach out. And so we're not giving them what they need when we make assumptions based, again, on a funny little CAT score.
Yes, very much so. But how can we address? So a lot of times when students are identified as quote unquote GNT, they tend to not be the most socially adept kids. And I don't know why that is. And maybe you can shed some light, but like, how can we address that social emotional needs part of GNT students and creating an environment in our schools that fosters that level of resilience and empathy and collaboration, instead of having these bunch of what we would quote as little geniuses off to the side being rather antisocial?
I think there's kind of a lot to unpack there. I think that there's this idea, again, that we have to separate or treat these kids differently. And it's really not treating these kids differently. Like, all kids should be treated the same. The access should be the same. When we walk into a classroom, all kids need to be challenged. There's no such thing as like this category of students needs to be sidelined or that they need to be doing things that are different. So I think that's the first thing. When I think about extension in the classroom means that all students receive challenge. There's no difference. And I think there's something there that says so much of the time we want to accelerate students to go faster, as opposed to doing deep dives and adding depth and complexity and exploration and inquiry to our classroom. I think it used to be that when we took a look at extension, we always thought, oh, extension means that I'm going to do an add-on task for every single lesson. And that add-on task is for those kids to go ahead. One of my friends told me this funny story a few years ago when it suddenly dawned on him that he was doing high ability extension wrong. And the first thing is high ability. Like it shouldn't just be for high ability students. It shouldn't just be targeted for them. But he was doing a class where he was teaching multiplication. And so he was having these kids create kind of like dots of like 4 dots across 5 dots. So they would draw 20 dots in total. And so he had one of his students come up to him and say, oh, I've done like 20 dots. And he's like, okay, now do 6 and 7. So he went in and he drew then 42 dots. And then he asked him to do like, let's say, okay, can you do like 12 times 13? And he's like, you want me to draw 1,214 dots? And he was like, yes, you're giving them more of the same, but it's not necessarily something that's creative or an exploration or interesting. It's just kind of saying, here's one more thing for you to do. And then it seems like busy work. And it seems like we've ticked a box saying that we've done something for these learners, when perhaps it's not the best thing that could have sparked an interest or given them something to explore and learn in a complex manner that again would help build their schemas, that they understood the greater world around them. And I think that's the trick.
Yeah, here's my follow-up question to that, because I think you've pointed out something in that story that is really key, that I, as a school leader and as a former teacher, have noticed that teachers tend to do. Oh, I differentiate. I give more work to my more able students, or I set them a little harder task. And sometimes it's just more dots on a paper, basically boring work. But what can they do? Like, talk to me about strategies, effective strategies for differentiated instruction, because teachers want to know. Now that we've really framed, and you've done a brilliant job, Morgan, of framing the problem. So people are listening to this podcast. Yes, this is a problem. Now we want to talk about what strategies, what can we do?
Yeah, I think that this is the trick, and it should be strategies that are for everyone. So I'd say first thing, it should be access for all. So access for all inside the classroom with extension, and access for all for any enrichment program that you have outside. So enrichment should be seen as this big thing that happens outside of the classroom as well. It's part of our CCAs. It's embedded in extension projects. But yes, everything should be open, available. It should be seen for all students. So I'd say that access for all is really key. That should always be a part of how we set up enrichment and extension in our classroom. The second thing I'd say has to do with Abdullah, that it's always not more, but interesting. So always not more, but interesting, which means that instead of just having one add-on task that you're doing for every single lesson, which then you might not even follow up on because you're not explicitly even marking it, perhaps, you're just kind of letting them get on with it. Not more, but interesting gives them a place to go to where they can always build up more knowledge. So you have longer, bigger projects that you can leave for students to investigate a larger theme or idea that's always there. And they should have a lot of ability to choose that passion because it should be open-ended enough that they can explore. So one of the things that we do that I've done in other schools as well is every single subject has an extension and enrichment project that students can always explore, and they get to tailor it to their own passions as well. And again, you want to make sure that you give them the opportunity to always dip into it. And that way they're building something that requires a lot of skills, self-regulation that you can celebrate afterwards, as opposed to just giving them that one like discrete task within the lesson, or simply forcing them ahead as opposed to allowing them to go deep down. And the other thing I'd say is that we want our lessons to be challenge first. So making every lesson count always says that challenge is the very first thing you want in every single lesson. I was doing learning walks in lower primary the other day. And one of the things that I noticed is that they have continuous provision. So there's these different stations set up for students. And the different stations had all of these different mini tasks that the students could do to build vocabulary. And then they could do this and this. And it was supposed to kind of scaffold their skills. And one of the things that they had in every single station was the challenge. And I thought it was so funny. And I asked one of the teachers, I'm like, well, how often do the students actually get to the challenge? And she looked at me and said, oh, they do the challenge first. They go for the challenge, the hardest task, and then they use the rest of the resources to figure out how to get the challenge done. And it was so neat to watch them because these kids went so far above and beyond. They were building a Moat and Bailey Castle model in year 2 that I would expect year 7 history students to build, because that was the challenge. And they used all of the other information to figure out how to get there. And I think instead of having a differentiated lesson where traditionally we'd say this is the work for low ability, for middle ability, and for high ability, where we do all, most, some, these learning objectives and lessons, that age has ended. We set one really clear learning intention. We make sure that students are aiming for that very high goal and that all students get there by scaffolding down. So I think that's the big thing. Set the expectation high for all students and then make sure that they are given what they need to scaffold up to it. There's all kinds of research on like the Rosenthal effect, for instance, that says that the expectations that we have of our students, they definitely feel that, and we change our behavior too. So it's really important that we maintain that standard. I think the idea that we spend so much time, and I spent years of my life putting together different mini lessons within lessons, printing off 3 different versions of tasks, dumbing down and deleting and diluting material to make it simpler for some students when I should have given them something complex and then guided them towards it. I think that's over. That's kind of us doing labor to prove that we're differentiating, as opposed to taking an approach of adaptive teaching, which is setting that high standard, walking around and individually helping these students one by one, give them what they need to reach and go where they are. It seems like that might be more time intensive, but we're at a stage now where we have enough adaptive technology to help us get there that's actually a lot easier than we'd imagine. So I think a challenge first approach to lessons. And again, it could be considered teaching to the top. It's not really targeting teaching to the top, the highest level, and expecting gaps, but instead it's saying, no, one standard, we are not differentiating our learning outcomes. We are saying that all students are capable of this and should have access to that challenge.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think what a lot of teachers struggle with is not that they don't want to have that learning outcome that is standard. I think the struggle is, how do you create access for the students who are not yet at that level to achieve that learning outcome? So much so that they can see clear steps on how they can get there. I think that's where the struggle is for teachers.
Definitely. I think one of the things that you hear the most is the gap is too wide. So like if I go into a classroom, and every classroom, no matter what, is a multi-ability classroom. If I go into the classroom and I have kids that they're having trouble multiplying and I'm trying to teach them differential equations, then what am I doing? Like, we have to have different expectations for students. And there is a trick there. It can be really, really hard for teachers when that gap is so wide. I mentioned before that technology is one of the ways to do that. So again, we can have different exploratory, larger challenges and aims for students that they always have something to go to be extended. And at the same time, they have to meet that standard. They can do go-ahead checklists. But I think for the students that really, really need to build that schema of knowledge up before they can actually tackle that high expectation that you might hold, for them, we can do things to give them the extra scaffolds, giving them lots of models and exemplars. You can have them do things like redrafting work. It's so important that we ask students to redraft to make sure that they are actually getting to a place where they reach a high standard. And that can be really time consuming, but redrafting lessons are amazing because you get a lot of one-on-one time and then they understand and they get the process for how they can improve. A lot of the times we want to forge forward with material or get through a curriculum specification when there's so much power in pausing and asking students to really reflect. That's how we get really, really good feedback from them. And they get the time to actually utilize that feedback. Self-reported grades where they are using the mark schemes, incredibly powerful. And I think Hattie has done so much work to say, like, student expectations, self-reported grades, excellent feedback. Like, these are things that are the basics of lessons that if we take the time to really put them into place without those ideas that these kids aren't as capable, all of a sudden you can really see them fly.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think there's a lot that you've put in there that I think teachers can extrapolate and apply to their classroom, especially the provision of scaffolds to help those students get to where you want them to go. In your experience, have you seen any programs that actually work with providing that access to all students, not just going around and identifying the one or two so-called gifted and talented, but really providing that, push and challenge for all students? Any programs you've seen that are noteworthy?
Oh, definitely. Actually, this is a good day to talk to me. So at our school, what we have done, and this is all the way from 3 years old to 18 years old, we have our enrichment program that is absolutely open to all students. And what we do is we make sure that we have subject-specific extension lists so that students within all lessons, and the very concept of our approach to teaching is challenge for all. Every single student is challenged and stretched. So we do lots of CPD to make sure that within lessons, our teachers are doing that. But outside of lessons, we have our enrichment program. And today for our enrichment program, we do one totally off timetable day per term for students to do enrichment activities. And throughout the school, these enrichment programs, the first term we focus on oracy. We do oracy competitions. We look at debate-centered argumentation. We look at how students can then use their own voice to speak about a topic that they love and are interested in. But then they have to really articulate something powerful about that topic that they have learned. So there's something really great about oracy. Next, we do creativity. So for a secondary school last term, we did an entire huge book. So it was basically a massive magazine where students did their own artwork, their poetry, but the theme was STEAM. So everything had to do with STEAM when we looked at design and technology within it. And then today we did inquiry. So it was oracy, creativity, and inquiry. Inquiry, these students are working on year-long extension projects. So those projects, every single subject offers, it's really open-ended. And those students today were looking at how they could present this at the end of the year in a symposium. And there's students at every single age and every single ability. They can put themselves forward. Teachers can nominate them because some students actually have issues in confidence. So you want to make sure that they have the opportunity to be nominated. A really great program way to get students involved is after they have nominated themselves or been nominated, you interview them. And I find it really interesting because when I've done action research afterwards and I ask students, well, like, why did you feel special doing this program? They're like, well, I felt selected and I felt really seen because I had an interview with the teacher that asked me about my interests and my passions and what I wanted to do my enrichment project on. And I think there's something really powerful there because then you are on your way to create learner profiles, which are a much better way to kind of touch on students and much more impactful and more involved than you creating an extension register. So there's something about kind of focusing on the individual student that can be really powerful. But yeah, I think there are great enrichment programs where you can focus on different projects within them, but you want to make sure that, again, they are absolutely accessible.
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds fantastic. And I think a lot of schools are headed that way. And if they're not, I'm sure they will see the value in heading that way. All right. So we're coming to our final question, Morgan. This has been so good. Oh, I loved it. What is your hope? What's the way forward? What's your hope in general for reimagining G&T in the global education space? What's your hope?
Well, I think that G&T, this is so strange because G&T has been historically so exclusive with selected students, this special category that we give extra attention to. I think that the way forward is diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that is the basis for gifted and talented, and we shouldn't call it gifted and talented. I think it should be challenge, extension, and enrichment. I think that that's the basis. I think that if you look at all of these programs with equity in mind, with that at the very core of a school, that's actually, there's a buy-in and leadership support, that is what drives it forward. I've just mentioned enrichment programs. So the students that are taking part in enrichment programs, I can say, oh yes, it's open. Anyone can attend. But is that true? So students might not be aware that they had to sign up, for instance, because there is a language barrier, or they're not confident because they're at risk or traumatized. We might have students that don't take part because it's after school and their parents have to pick them up. We have students that might not take part because of familiar obligations, or they have jobs, or they can't take part in things on the weekend. They can't afford, let's say, the fees that might otherwise allow them to do things like go on a Model United Nations conference or a debating society. So there are all these other things that actually deny students access to programs. If we were doing advanced placement classes, another example is if you can afford private tutoring. So when we take a look at diversity, equity, inclusion, it's thinking of all of those barriers and anticipating them, and then making sure that students actually can take part. And sometimes it's more than just saying, okay, it's a free-for-all, everyone can come. It means that certain groups should be invited, that it is culturally responsive instruction as well, to make sure that we are actually tracking and being responsive to our students' need and celebratory of the really diverse communities that we are teaching. So I think if we change the lens for enrichment programs, not just to say, oh, everyone can come, but to say everyone is invited. And we are really thoughtfully putting in policies and programs in place that allow all students to actually be enriched. That's going to be the heart and the core of how we can change the narrative to switch the paradigm.
Brilliant. That's a fantastic place to end the pod. Thank you, Morgan.
Thank you so much.
It's been brilliant having you. We are excitedly anticipating your book. When does it come out?
I think it's coming out in September, so I'm really excited. Just finishing up the last chapter now, so I might use some of our insights today, quickly write them up. So yeah, thank you for asking such great questions.
Oh, no, you're most welcome. It's a very, very interesting topic, and you've done such a brilliant job today of really diving into it and giving us some fantastic insights. We will definitely put the links to how you can connect with Morgan in our show notes. So go and connect with her, learn more. When the book comes out, please go ahead and purchase that and put that in your personal libraries and your school libraries, so that we are all together reimagining gifted and talented education, banishing that word gifted and talented, bringing in that whole stretch, challenge, enrichment, and making sure that all students are given the opportunity to shine in their way, because that is really what education is all about. It's been brilliant having you, Morgan, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Teach Middle East podcast. Visit our website, teachmiddleeast.com, and follow us on social media. The links are in the show notes.